In section 3.7, the first type of problem that we see is simply asking you to find the equations of the vertical and horizontal asymptotes. And in general, vertical asymptotes can be found by setting the denominator of your rational function equal to 0. So that is pretty straightforward in every problem. That's how to find a vertical asymptote. The horizontal asymptote is a little bit more involved, but in a lot of cases is actually less work as long as you understand the process. And it depends on the degree of the numerator and the denominator and how they relate to each other. So let's do a few examples. Problem number 14 from 3.7, the denominator, in order to find the vertical asymptotes, as we mentioned, we set the denominator equal to 0. Well, if the denominator is equal to 0, then that would mean that x must be negative 4. So the vertical asymptote is x equal negative 4. The horizontal asymptote, what we want to do is look at the degree of the numerator and the degree of the denominator. So notice that the largest power of x in the numerator is 1, and the largest power of x in the denominator is also 1. So since they are both degree 1, then the horizontal asymptote has the equation y equals, and then what you do is you take what's called the leading coefficient of the numerator, which means the number in front of the highest power of x, so in this case a 2, over the leading coefficient of the denominator, the number in front of the highest power of x, which in this case is 1. And of course you could more simply write that as y equals 2. So that's the vertical asymptote and horizontal asymptote for that problem. Let's look at the next example. Here we're given another rational function. So finding the vertical asymptote, we set the denominator equal to 0. That would mean that x is equal to negative 6. Horizontal asymptote, we once again want to look at the degree of the numerator as opposed to the degree of the denominator. Well, the numerator has x to the second power, so it's a degree 2 numerator, and the denominator has a degree 1 because x's largest power is the first power. Since the degree of the numerator is larger than the degree of the denominator, there actually is no horizontal asymptote. So if the degrees are the same, then you take the ratio of the leading coefficients. If the degree of the top is larger than the degree of the bottom, there is no horizontal asymptote. Now let's look at a third example, number 16. We've got this rational function. Again, vertical asymptotes are simply setting the denominator equal to 0. Well, in this case, it's already factored for you. If you were to set the denominator equal to 0, this factor would give you a result of x equals negative 1/2, and this factor would give you a result of x equals 5. So that's setting each factor equal to 0. Now, in this case, we want to check the degree of the numerator and the degree of the denominator. Well, clearly the numerator is degree 1 because the largest power of x is 1. If we were to multiply out the denominator, however, we would see that there would be an x squared term. So the degree of the denominator is 2, which means the degree of the denominator is larger than the degree of the numerator. In that case, your horizontal asymptote is y equals 0. So there's 3 cases, and I've done one example of each case. If the degrees are the same, then you take the ratio of the leading coefficients for your horizontal asymptote. If the degree of the numerator is larger, there is no horizontal asymptote. And if the degree of the denominator is larger, then the horizontal asymptote is y equals 0.